In a previous lesson on historic designation, we discussed the importance of historic integrity, or the ability for a property to show its historic significance. Physical preservation is the practical application of that. How do we maintain and work on a historic building or site so that it retains a high level of historic integrity? As you could imagine, the answer can and should be quite different across millions of historic sites in the United States. Sometimes associated with the term brick-and-mortar, this type of preservation work means you are physically working with the actual building or site, rather than stopping after documentation, designation, and interpretation, which are still important steps that can come before, during, or after physical preservation. Ever since historic preservation became a profession, there has been a lot of discussion about what is considered acceptable and not acceptable in physical preservation. The most widely accepted guidelines in the United States are the Secretary of Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties, often shortened to Secretary of Interior Standards or SOI standards. You'll often see it listed as a requirement for grant and financial incentive programs that involve physical preservation, such as the Federal Historic Tax Credit. Physical preservation is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Each historic resource will require a different treatment. The goal is to preserve what are called character-defining features, or physical attributes of an historic resource that are important to show its historic significance. You can also think of character-defining features as the building blocks that effectively tell a place's story. The Secretary of Interior Standards has defined 4 physical preservation treatments. Most often, projects will not fall neatly into one approach or another, but employ multiple. Regardless, these categories can be useful ways to start thinking about how to approach this work. The first is preservation. Note that while the word preservation may also refer more generally to the historic preservation field, in this case it means to maintain the current use, materials, and configuration, or to prevent further loss and deterioration. Preservation is the least invasive approach and involves largely keeping historic features in their current form. Work in this category tends to be smaller in scale and may often come in the form of regular maintenance. This is most appropriate for historic places that have previously not been well maintained but do not need any significant alterations or reconstruction of historic features. It is also a common application for historic ruins or remnants where stabilizing it in its current condition is favorable to restoration or reconstruction. One example is the Panama Hotel's treatment of its Japanese-style bathhouse, which is the most intact example of its kind in North America. While the historic 1910 single-room occupancy was rehabilitated to become a hotel, the bathhouse, which closed in 1963, was largely kept in its original configuration and no original materials have been replaced. The next is rehabilitation, which is a treatment in which a historic resource is adapted to meet the current needs of its users while retaining its historic character, also called adaptive reuse. For some, this is the most exciting historic preservation treatment because it can activate neglected or underutilized buildings and sites for present-day needs. Guidelines in rehabilitation do not completely prohibit new construction or materials, but instead seek to create a balance between historic integrity and its continued relevance to today. A good way to ensure character-defining features are kept would be to find a compatible use in its historic configuration, so that little alterations or new construction are needed. Examples of rehabilitation include the Quincy Grammar School, which was turned from an historic school for Chinese Americans to a cultural center, the Lujan House in Guam, which was adapted from a historic house to become the Guam Preservation Trust office, and the Publix Hotel in Seattle, which used the Federal Historic Tax Credit to adapt a historic Japanese grocery store and single-room occupancy building into an apartment complex and ground floor retail. Another is restoration, which reverts the physical condition to a specific time period. This treatment is most often used for historic resources with a public education component, such as house museums or designed landscapes. Restoration requires a relatively clear period of significance, which can be tough for historic sites that have multiple layers of history. You might see restoration as a solution to places that suffer from almost or near lost status due to neglect, erasure, or natural disasters. A related approach is reconstruction, which rebuilds what has substantially been demolished or no longer exists. Similar to restoration, reconstruction is most often used for historic resources that have public-facing programming. In both restoration and reconstruction, it's important to act based on detailed documentation of its historic appearance. Examples of restoration and reconstruction include Japanese American incarceration sites, where historic barracks and guard towers have been reconstructed, restoration of historic properties in Lahaina, Maui after the 2023 fire, and the Chinese American Historical Museum in San Jose, which reconstructed the demolished Ing-Shingung building, originally built in 1888. These 4 treatments cover the type of work that is typically funded by physical preservation grant and financial incentive programs. However, they don't cover all the work that may be required. Specifically, new construction at historic sites is an important consideration. Technically, the latest updates to the Secretary of Interior standards have added guidance on new construction under the larger umbrella of rehabilitation. However, most preservation grant or tax credit programs will not fund new construction directly, and many view it outside the scope of preservation work. Still, it's important to think of new construction as an extension of preservation. In many cases, new construction and additions are required to adaptively reuse buildings and sites while still preserving their character-defining features. For example, the Eng House rehabilitation required a rear addition that provided ADA accessibility and additional interpretive space. This new construction made the overall presentation and future use of the space for public education possible, going above the inherited limits of a single-family home. Another new construction or addition possibility is commemoration, such as memorials, murals, or interpretive signs. This can be particularly important for historic sites that have been demolished or erased, and give a voice to a place lacking any remaining character-defining features from its past. One example is the Arch of Healing and Reconciliation in Bellingham, Washington, which was dedicated in 2018 to commemorate Chinese American expulsion in 1885, Japanese American incarceration in 1942, and violence against Indian Americans in the 1907 Bellingham riot, considered one of the largest discriminatory events against South Asian immigrants in the United States. The monument highlights these key moments in Bellingham's history where little physical historic evidence remains, and interpretation and memorialization are required to understand them in place. Other examples include interpretive installations in Denver's Lost Chinatown and historic plaques marking early Filipino settlements in Morro Bay and St. Malo. Overall, all forms of physical preservation should follow some general guidelines. The first is to preserve existing character-defining features of an historic building or site. Any other work, such as reconstruction or new construction, should not diminish or destroy these features. Another is to repair rather than replace, whenever possible. Note that while it's generally encouraged, repairing rather than replacing may not always be feasible or favorable. Factors in this decision could include a specific feature's level of importance to the overall historic significance, the quality of the replacement, available funding, environmental considerations, and others. Next is that any new construction should be complementary to the existing historic site through its scale, materials, massing, and overall design. Lastly, new construction and other modern features should be differentiated from the historic building or site, and not create a false sense of historicism. Similarly, restoration and reconstruction work should be based on concrete evidence, and not on assumptions about the original feature's appearance. With all that being said, remember that these are guidelines and not rules, which means there's not always a clear answer. Each physical preservation project will require different approaches and judgment calls. If you're unsure about where to start or which treatments to pursue, a good starting point can always be to reach out to APIAHiP or your local preservation nonprofit. Now, pursuing physical preservation is often one of the most expensive parts of historic preservation. Outside of everyday maintenance, you'll likely need to hire a professional, and the costs and timelines can vary widely depending on the scope of work. Though it can be daunting, it's important to know where to start and how to break that process into bite-sized chunks. A good first step is to understand what type of work the historic resource requires. This can be simple as a do-it-yourself inspection to inform initial thoughts, to working with a preservation professional to identify aesthetic and structural priorities. This assessment should be conducted in relation to, and sometimes inform, the intended use or overarching purpose of this preservation project. This can range from simple upkeep for continued use to a rehabilitation project that adaptively reuses a vacant historic building. These conclusions on physical preservation priorities and goals will often come in the form of a feasibility study, historic structures report, or preservation plan. From there, you can begin to identify how much the work will cost. Getting estimates from trusted professionals in your area for the needed work will help narrow down the price range. Having this information on hand will help make you more competitive for grants and other funding programs, as reviewers will have a good sense of what you need to get done and how much it will cost. Lastly, it's important to plan for sustained maintenance after the project. What upkeep is required to prevent future issues, who will do that work, and where the funding will come from. While completing a major physical preservation project is a huge milestone, having a plan for long-term maintenance is just as important. Now, the process can be intimidating, particularly when resources are limited. But as with many other things in historic preservation, it's best to work with multiple people and stakeholders for a successful project. Contact a preservation nonprofit like APIAHiP for professional guidance, talk with neighbors and local organizations to generate public support, and cast a wide net to find potential partners and funders in your project. Physical preservation, at the end of the day, is a core component to ensuring our historic places retain meaning for generations to come. Hopefully, this lesson provided the basics to begin thinking about that process and reminded you that you're not alone in this. As always, feel free to contact APIAHiP for any questions you may have, and for more information and resources, please see our website at apiahip.org.